Man, you guys are not going to believe what I just watched on SportsCenter. They dedicated like a whole segment to breaking down the NBA's latest attempt to combat tanking. And honestly, some of the proposals they were discussing had the analysts absolutely losing their minds. But here's the thing that really caught my attention. While they were going through all these potential rule changes and what they would mean for the league, they started talking specifically about the Warriors and how Golden State might need to pivot their strategy depending on what gets implemented. And that's when the conversation shifted to potential roster moves, and Caris LeVert's name came up as someone who could make a ton of sense for what the Warriors are trying to build. Hey, what's up everyone? Real quick before we get into everything, that like button is literally what determines if this reaches hundreds or thousands of fans. Takes 1 second, but makes a huge impact on the channel's growth. Just smash that like button right now. It's the easiest thing you can do, but honestly, the biggest way to support this content. Every single like pushes this further, so hit it now. But let me start from the beginning, because the tanking discussion was wild. So according to what the SportsCenter analysts were reporting, Commissioner Adam Silver apparently informed all 30 general managers that the NBA is planning to make some anti-tanking rule changes for next season. Shams Charania broke the story, and the league has apparently been having intensified dialogue about how to combat teams that are losing on purpose. And look, they went through at least 7 different proposals that have been brought up, and I'm telling you, some of these ideas had the analysts scratching their heads, trying to figure out how they would actually work in practice. The first idea they discussed was that first-round picks could only be protected top 4 or top 14 plus. Basically, lottery protected with no in-between options like we see now. The analysts were pretty skeptical about this one right off the bat. They were saying that teams are just going to tank even harder to guarantee themselves the worst possible record. Because if you're the worst team in the league, the lowest you can fall in the draft is 5th overall. So instead of discouraging tanking, this might actually incentivize teams to be even more aggressive about losing games to secure those top 4 odds. The Pacers put those special protections on the pick they sent to the Clippers for Zubac. But if you eliminate those middle options, teams will just adjust their strategy accordingly. The second proposal was freezing lottery odds at the trade deadline or at some later specified date. The SportsCenter crew actually thought this one wasn't terrible compared to some of the others, but they still identified some major loopholes. The concern is that teams will just start tanking earlier in the season. You're going to see franchises like the Nets, the Pelicans, and the Wizards fully commit to the tank from day 1 instead of waiting until after the All-Star break. So instead of having teams compete for the first half of the season and then shut it down, you'd have teams not even trying from opening night. That doesn't exactly improve the product on the court. Then they got to the third idea, which was that no team could pick top 4 in consecutive years or after having consecutive bottom 3 finishes. One of the analysts absolutely went off on this one because it creates so many problems. He made the point that some teams aren't even trying to tank, they're just genuinely that bad. Look at the Nets multiple times over the past decade. They haven't needed to try to lose, they've just been awful organically. Are you really going to penalize a horrific basketball team even further by taking away their chance to get a top pick? That makes no sense. And what about a team like the Hornets, who picked 4th last year and then actually tried to compete this season, but still ended up missing the playoffs? If the lottery balls happen to fall their way, you're just not going to allow that? At that point, the analysts were saying you might as well just eliminate the lottery entirely and go back to inverse standings order, because you're defeating the whole purpose of having randomness in the system. The fourth proposal was that teams can't pick top 4 the year after making the conference finals. The analysts acknowledged that this doesn't come up super often, but they raised a really interesting scenario. What if you have an aging team that's been making deep playoff runs, maybe even won championships before, And then, after one final conference finals appearance, they decide to blow it up because the core is too old to compete anymore. You're telling me that team can't try to get a top pick the following year when they're going to be one of the worst teams in the league after selling off all their assets? That seems incredibly punitive for a franchise that's actually doing the smart thing by recognizing their window has closed and beginning a proper rebuild. The fifth idea made the analysts' heads spin. Lottery odds allocated based on 2-year records instead of just 1 year. They were genuinely baffled by this one because all it does is encourage teams to tank for longer periods of time. The Nets, the Pelicans, the Jazz, none of those teams think they're competing in the next 2 years anyway. So they're just going to commit to a 2-year tank instead of a 1-year tank. They won't try to improve the roster in the offseason, and they'll go out and play at the same level or worse the following year. Instead of limiting tanking, this proposal would actually encourage more tanking for longer stretches. The analyst was like, "Who writes this stuff? It's counterproductive in every possible way." The sixth proposal was extending the lottery to include all play-in teams. And this is where the SportsCenter crew really started pointing out the contradictions in all these proposals. You just said teams can't pick top 4 after making the conference finals, but now you're saying play-in teams should be in the lottery? So what? The Heat, after they made the finals against the Nuggets, could have been picking in the top 3? That makes absolutely no sense. One of the analysts made the point that a lot of these ideas are coming from Ivy League-educated executives, and they should probably be thinking harder about the implications before floating these proposals publicly. The seventh and final major idea was flattening lottery odds for all lottery teams. The consensus on the desk was that this would blow up in the NBA's face spectacularly. If you give the Nets, the Pelicans, the Wizards, and the Jazz the same odds for a top 3 pick as a team like the Warriors who might just barely miss the playoffs, the bad teams will never truly get better. You'd see teams like the Mavericks and Hawks from recent years moving up into the top 3 every single season, while the truly terrible teams keep getting leapfrogged. One analyst suggested a compromise where you flatten the odds for just the top 8 teams in the lottery, while teams 9 through 14 would have much lower odds since they were close to making the playoffs anyway. They also floated some alternative solutions that the analysts thought might actually work better. One was eliminating all protections on traded picks entirely. Once you trade a first-round pick, it's gone to the other team with no strings attached. This would remove the incentive to tank, because if you don't have your pick, what's the point of losing? Another creative idea was that teams can't raise ticket prices if they're losing. Hit the owners in their pockets, since they're the ones making these tanking decisions without seeing any real repercussions. The analysts acknowledged that one would never get agreed upon, but it's an interesting concept. The overall sentiment from the SportsCenter crew was pretty pessimistic about the league's ability to actually solve this problem. One of the analysts basically said that for every rule the NBA implements, professional basketball executives will find a loophole. He said he's not even Harvard-educated, and he was able to identify loopholes in every single proposal they discussed. So imagine what these sophisticated front office types will come up with when they have months to strategize. Now, here's where the conversation got really interesting for Warriors fans. The analysts started discussing how these potential rule changes would affect specific teams, and Golden State came up as a fascinating case study. The Warriors aren't really a tanking franchise. They've been a perennial playoff team for the last decade plus. They've won championships. They've competed at the highest level. But right now, they're sitting around that 15th draft slot, kind of in no man's land where they're not good enough to really contend and not bad enough to get a premium pick. The analysts were talking about how any rule that discourages tanking would actually end up benefiting the Warriors because it levels the playing field for teams that are trying to compete but just fall short. If you flatten lottery odds or include play-in teams in the lottery, suddenly Golden State has better odds of moving up even if they just barely miss the playoffs. That could be significant for a franchise that's trying to remain competitive while also adding young talent through the draft. But then the conversation shifted to what the Warriors should be doing right now to maximize their chances of success, regardless of what rule changes get implemented. And that's when Caris LeVert's name came up as a potential acquisition target that makes a lot of sense for what Golden State is trying to accomplish. The SportsCenter analysts broke down why LeVert would be such a good fit for the Warriors' system, and honestly, the more they talked about it, the more it made sense. First, they emphasized his experience and basketball IQ. LeVert is a veteran who has been around the league for a while now. He's played in different systems, he's been on playoff teams, and he understands how to contribute to winning basketball. That kind of experience is invaluable for a Warriors team that's still built around winning now with Steph Curry leading the way. What really stood out in their analysis was how LeVert's style of play meshes with what Golden State does offensively. The Warriors have always valued ball movement, player movement, and unselfish basketball. They want guys who can operate within a system, make the right reads, and keep the offense flowing. LeVert fits that perfectly because he's not someone who needs to dominate the ball to be effective. He can score without being ball dominant, he can create for others, and he understands spacing and timing. Those are exactly the qualities you need to succeed in Steve Kerr's system. The analysts also talked about LeVert's versatility as an offensive player. Even though he hasn't been producing at his highest level this season with the Pistons, his track record shows that he can score at all three levels when he's in the right situation. He's shown the ability to be a primary creator when needed, but he's also comfortable playing off the ball and being a secondary or tertiary option. That dual functionality is huge for the Warriors because it gives them flexibility in how they use him. He could run the second unit and be the primary ball handler with the bench, or he could play alongside Steph and the starters in a more complementary role.